Okay, so yeah, I thought it'd be cool to talk about. There's a couple of worlds that you're kind of immersed in and teaching. One of them is the somatic imaginal, which is, yeah, you sort of I guess you created that phrase as well, which is very evocative of that world. And then the other one is myth and metaphor. And today I thought it'd be cool to just talk about myth and metaphor. Is there anything you want to say as like a quick intro, or yeah, what feels
less of an intro than a caveat, which is that, like, for me, this one's got a lot of sprawl just because it is everything essentially. So we're gonna probably have to anchor back a few times and keep on focus. But yeah, this one's got legs for me.
Yeah, it's super. I think what is super interesting is every conversation every conversation is starting with this topic is everything. It's almost like every single one
Everything
of
is
these,
everything.
yeah, it's like a fractal nature of this model that every single aspect of it can be the lens in which you see the whole thing through.
Yeah.
And that's just cool. And yeah, they're sort of, or they all have the capacity to go into a kind of boundaryless, entirely inclusive perspective on experience or something. Yeah, so yeah, huge topic, good caveat. And then I think what was super interesting yesterday is so I guess maybe just as like a very brief intro to people who haven't like come across this yet, it's almost like there's a way that metaphor and myth can start to create a huge amount of flexibility in experience, where rather than seeing yourself as like I'm Rosa and this is my life, and it's like having a very fixed timeline of kind of like this is what I'm doing in life, this is who I am. There's a way that if you start introducing myth, you get a lot more freedom in the way that you relate to yourself, the world. And then equally with metaphor is kind of like it's like the same mechanism but maybe on a more granular level, where if you start noticing how you use language and what metaphors that you use to relate to things, then you get a certain amount of like flexibility and agency around that. I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head. But yeah, like I guess off the top of my head, it's a metaphor. I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head that has a certain like, anxious kind of like, I'm looking for a thing off the top of my head. Whereas if I instead said, I'm like feeling deeply into the depths of me to pull something out, it's like then I'm going in and like pulling myself down and grounding. And it's kind of like the metaphors are revealing reality to us, and also the metaphors we choose are creating reality. So there's like just a conversation that's happening there at all levels, at all times. So that's kind of the bit of experience that we're pointing to. Is anything you want to add to that feels important or burning?
Yeah, one thing, just that, like, I'm not sure how much explanation this one will take, but essentially that, like, we respond really, really well and really, really deeply to what I would just call like mythopoetic cues, essentially, or like metaphorical cues, all these things that are just invoking myths and metaphors and putting particular lenses on experience. We respond to these incredibly well, largely because, as far as I can tell, like, yeah, back to my old phrase, mythopoetic cognition is the engine of mind. Like, yeah, mythopoesis is kind of the base level of human experience, as far as I can tell. It's the whole way that we're kind of wired to experience everything. So by being able to actually dip down to that level, not from like an intellectual place and kind of dropping things down onto it from above, but like really getting down to that root level and working with it, basically everything opens up pretty much in concert with however deep you're able to get into that, which there are also dangers too. You can mess a lot of stuff up if you have root access, and you should not have root access, right? So, advertisement and warning. That feels like one of the base core layers of what it is to be human is mythopoetic experience, mythopoetic cues, the myths we live by. And yeah, be careful with that, but also be empowered by that. It's great.
Yeah, nice. And I think that's nice bringing in that phrase. And there's a really nice paper written kind of around that topic that I will link to as well, because it's like, yeah, I guess it's kind of like seems that there's a collective waking up to this aspect of experience that feels I think it can get, because it's very like mythic and based in story and things like that, it's very easy for people to maybe write it off as just like, oh, it's just this thing. But actually there seems to be a stronger kind of collective feel of like, oh, this is actually a like real part of experience. And in a way, when you start to experience it and feel it in your being, it's the most real thing in a way. It's like, oh
yeah, that itself is actually a pretty good example. The reason for a lot of the somatic imaginal stuff that I was doing and that I've been talking about endlessly is to bring it back into direct experience, because even the cultural metaphors, the cultural language, the whole way that our culture treats, even just on the level of the words, myth, legend, lore, metaphor, all of these things, imagination especially, all of them are basically synonymous with lies, falsehood, things that are blown out of proportion, things that don't actually matter. Just like, oh, that's a myth. Oh, I heard that, but I think that's just a legend that goes around, or it's just imaginary. And this entire layer of experience that is the core layer of experience has been very purposefully and assiduously denigrated for what, a couple hundred years, that we've just kind of as a culture agreed to shove that into the ground and make sure that everyone knows you don't take it seriously. If you want to be taken seriously and do real things, ignore that whole layer of experience. Don't worry about it, etc., etc. So even that itself is like a metaphor. We've built up an entire cultural, mythic vocabulary around mythic vocabulary that is, don't worry about that. It doesn't matter. Shove it down. Oh, all of the people who make like the greatest contributions to society and culture and technology and science are all operating on this level. Weird. Don't think too much about that. And like, who are you to think you should do it too? They were geniuses. You can't pull it off. And yeah, so that itself is a very solid example of the mythopoetic engineering that goes into forming a life and culture and creating the pathways that energy is allowed to flow through, that like humans are allowed to put themselves into and lean into. Incredibly powerful. It's the whole thing.
Yeah, it's interesting as you talk about that. There's a way in which the location of it on the map suddenly like comes to the fore, where there's a sense of, I think there's a difference between, it's worth saying that there's a difference between just accepting myths that you are given and having the capacity to feel into what is present for you and come into like relationship with it, come into connection with it. And there's a way that, depending which way you go, you've either gone through a whole load of stuff around kind of like making space, shadow work, getting in touch with your subtle body, like really being able to feel into your present moment, which I know you've done a lot of work on that sort of thing as well. or if you're coming along the like yang path for soul, yeah, you're starting with somatic imaginal, which is like really being in your experience, and then going into eros, which is about like following your thread, which I think when you were talking about the geniuses and people who are really in their imaginations, there's a sense of like they've found something and they've picked it up and they're like got their thread and they're like, yes, this, I'm going after this. Then they kind of get into the space where you can, yeah, it's almost like that world where if you go really deeply and really intimately connect with a world with a lot of eros, it's like the world can come alive, and you're sort of like in it and navigating it. And yeah, just like a really nice example is scientists, you know, Einstein, who starts to be able to see and feel and interact with the things that it like comes from really deep knowledge, giving yourself to something, all of those things. Yeah, so it's quite, I think it's like quite a deep, I think it's worth saying that with metaphor and myth, when we're talking about, it's quite a like deep practice, that it's not just like, oh, picking up a story and being like, oh, I'm telling stories and da, 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 da. I mean, it can be that in a light way, but what we're talking about here is like a really embodied practice.
Yeah, there's something here about like the not quite near enemies, but like things that look like it, seem like it, but ain't it. And there's a ton of that in the area of just like, yeah, like 3 or 4 different domains that I can think of. One of which is like the college freshman philosophy 101 thing of like, all of this is just cultural constructs and I can see through it now and we're good. Good, cool, recognize that. Excellent history and so on. But when that's just all up here, and when it's just all up here and it's not something you can actually directly sense, it's just the words that some other person gave to you, that's a whole other thing. B, when you're like, when that is an instrument for your own myth that you are trying to live in, which it most often is like, I think this should be the case, but this is the case. And hey, this is historically constructed and put together by people 300 years ago and blah, blah, blah. Tear it down. Not the thing, right? Separate issue. And then there's another bit that's just the very cutesy, like, I don't know, new agey, neo-shamanic pop psychology type thing of just like, you've been telling yourself a story that's not very helpful your whole life, and now tell yourself that you're empowered and look in the mirror and say it, you are a lion, and this type of stuff. Which is also, yeah, incredibly up here, top down, just like trying to impose it onto the rest of the system. And there's a lot to be said for like going from both top down and bottom up at the same time and trying to like meet them in the middle. But the bottom up doesn't really seem to exist out there in the world. Like I've only the small handful of people that I've seen talking about it in a particularly deep way and way that like particularly recognizes that slow awareness and movement and like deep practice and foundation aspect of these stories, of these myths and metaphors. Like 2 of them are in the room right now, and there's probably like 5 others that I've met or seen ever. So yeah, just to point to the near enemy, not quite an enemy, but that's not really what we're talking about here. The top down, retell your story with you as the hero type
Yeah,
thing.
totally. Yeah. I think there's something interesting about top down. Like, but bottom up, I think I agree. It's like it's like the sort of safer, more robust way to go about things. If people are really keen on top down, there's a way that it's almost like you're doing the map from the reverse side, and it's almost like you really have to start from a kind of a level of mysticism where you're essentially starting from life's just like an entire mystery and we have no idea what it is, and it's an expression of something that is, you know, mystical and strange and moves in ways that we don't understand. And then it's like if you start from there, then you can kind of come into the top down, and then sort of build the metaphor and myth on top of that and be like, okay, so from that understanding, like what metaphors and myths are here. But most people, I think that's a very difficult move for people to do. That's rare for people to be able to, like, there's so much in the cultural, just in our minds, so much like stuff that's for most people, it makes a lot more sense to go to just start where they are.
Yeah. And there's another thing that's probably worth pointing. I kind of pointed at it earlier, but like there's also a fairly healthy fear around this type of stuff when we do start expressing how like deep and foundation level it is. And a response that you'll get a lot of the time is just like, oh, like that stuff is really core to like who I am. I don't want to be like messing with that area or pushing on it, tugging it, just like shoving in new myths there. I don't want to be abusing my root access to my own psyche and soul, right?
Yeah, totally. This is nice. I think this segs into the other part we wanted to talk about, which is like, it's almost like it's almost like seeing that. I think the way you described it is really nice, that contemplative practice, it's very hard to see from the outside the different kind of archetypes, metaphors, myths that people are sharing and like emulating. And there's a tendency for teachers or leaders or people talking about like sharing their path amongst peers to kind of like just assume that everyone's wanting to do the same thing, or that they have the right thing, or there's only one way to do it. And I think there's something about making the differences explicit of these places. And I was just thinking about what you were saying, and there's a way that I just have a very low fear. I was just built with a very low amount of fear. So I just like ran at this bit, metaphor and myth, at a million miles an hour. I was like, oh, Jung went psychotic, cool. Like, I'll do that.
Right.
Just sort of like
I could do a few years of psychosis. It seems fine.
Yeah, just dissolved into the archetypal realm. And like that there's a way that that's just part of my expression. I'm like, I've got to get to the bottom of everything. That's like, and it wasn't, it's not something that I encourage others to do at all. There's always kind of wisdom in fear, I think, and keeping us safe and things like that. So it's something that I'm always aware of. I'm like navigating in some way when I'm talking about stuff. It's like helping people on some level make the choice of what they want and be their own guide in that, rather than saying like, hey, you should do what I did, because it's sort of explicitly not that. But I don't know, I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what you how you were relating to this bit as well.
Yeah, so what we mentioned, the metaphor we were using for some of this yesterday was like basically with sports, how it's really clear outwardly for people that like if you want X results, then you must do X thing. And like, sorry, my cat is playing with my foot right now. He's very bored. But yeah, so like there's always the thing like, do you want a swimmer's body? Work out like a swimmer. You want a boxer's body? Work out like a boxer. You want giant beefy legs? Do leg day constantly, right? And yeah, this is kind of known that there's like that there are fairly direct connections between what you're kind of going for, what you want to do, and what you have to do to get there. And in so much of like the inner work, contemplative stuff, meditation worlds, there's not really that line. And every area of work kind of implicitly, or in many cases explicitly, tries to say like, oh no, you can do all of those things with this thing, right? So it'd be basically as if like you've got swimmers who are the most proud of swimming and think it's the best thing, and someone comes in and is like, hey, like I really want to get like huge strong legs and really be able to just support an enormous amount of weight and get real beefy Captain America legs. And they're like, well, all things are possible with swimming. Like, we're going to start you off with some like breaststroke and then some backstroke. And you can train with them for several weeks before you start noticing just like, I've been doing like a lot of arm stuff and a lot of breathing stuff, but like my legs have not changed significantly, right?
Yeah.
And if you're really unlucky, you can just completely turn yourself over to trust in them and go 3, 4, 10, 15 years, and then suddenly look back at your old journals and remember like, oh, right, there was like a longing for big, beefy Captain America legs in me.
Yeah.
And I forgot about that entirely because I got lost in the swimmer's path. And then there's a bunch of regret that comes with that, which is one thing when it's, if you want beefy legs, that's not that high stakes in the grand scope of things. But if your soul is pulling you towards being a particular expression of pattern, if you are feeling drawn towards something that you barely have a name for because it's barely coming online for you, but you're just pointing yourself at sacredness and discipline and opening up and all of these things that you just know is in the direction of the divine, in the direction of a fuller expression of what is wanting to be expressed through you. And then you run across practice X over here that is, if you take a bird's eye view, it's directed off over here. You're trying to go over here. But the teachers, the practices, the culture around it, everything just says like, oh no, wherever you're trying to go, this is where it is. You must do concentration meditation. And again, you can go a very long time with just the promise of, oh no, we'll get you to the thing. We'll help you express yourself, be what you are, move towards your stuff. You can go for years there and then suddenly notice, oh, wait, now I have context that I didn't have back then. I can now see that I've been going off in this direction and feeling really weird and off about it, which I thought was just like a normal part of this path. And everyone said, it's fine, just keep working, keep working. And now with that context, you can kind of see, oh no, like my soul wanted to go over here. This was the direction that everything in me was pulling. I've been yanked off here for however long. And now I'm like further away from this than when I started. I've now got things to unlearn from this that are going to be needed over there. All of which is semi-abstract, but like very much not in the realm of the abstract. This happens constantly. Every path kind of wants to be the one path, the one thing that everyone can do and is the right way for everyone. And yeah, I pick on the Buddhists too much, so I'm not going to bring them in here.
Always up for picking on some Buddhists.
But they're real good at it. They're one of the
they are good at it.
Examples I've ever seen.
They make themselves an easy
like,
target.
Yeah, they're just I don't know. There's that thing where it's like you come in and say like, I want X. And they're really good at going like, well, truly all humans want Y, but he's not wise enough to see that.
You actually don't have a cell. Yeah.
So we'll talk to him in the language of X and it'll be fine. And by the time he gets far enough along, he'll have deepened into enough wisdom to see that what we want for him is actually truly what he wanted for himself. And like that attitude is not limited to the Buddhists by any means. Yeah. They're just the best at it. They've honed it to art.
They've created the conditions for that particular meme to flourish.
Yeah. But no, it's a fairly common one. And a lot of it is only possible because of like, yeah, this thing we were talking about earlier, where like you just don't allow enough context around things. You don't allow this sense of openness and knowing like, hey, this leads over here, that goes over there, where are you feeling pulled? You kind of just lock everything down and don't admit to a context a lot of the time. And again, there's a difference between implicit and explicit here, where like,
yeah, totally. I really like the sports metaphor. I think that's nice because it's something that's very apparent on the surface. And I think that's a way that like I think it's even broader than the kind of training aspect. There's a way that it's almost like there's completely different types of sports, like team sports,
Mm.
sports you do on your own. There's like ways of doing sports differently. It's like, do you want to train to ultra marathons, or do you just want something that keeps you a bit fit and healthy? There's kind of like all of these different things, and yeah, it's almost like, I think when you get into the implicit and explicit thing, it's almost like there's a way that it becomes a bit culty if things are implicit, and you're sort of like tricking people into being somewhere. And I don't think it has bad intentions behind it generally. I think it generally is just people not having the capacity or the perspective of this metaphor and myth box. I think it's like they can't see outside their own metaphor and myth, and so they have kind of absorbed that as the thing. And yeah, I think what's it's almost like the first time when you were describing that metaphor to me, I was like, yeah, this makes sense. It's almost like there's a couple of stages of things that I'm trying to do with this course, and that we're kind of like creating together, which is one, showing people that there are different sports and being like, hey, there's loads of different sports, and like like think about what resonates with you. Because I think most people, even the step you were saying where people think that they want Captain America legs, or are really pulled towards the mountains and doing hiking or something, it's almost like people haven't even done that stage of looking in and connecting with like, oh, this is what I want. So it's almost like first giving people the empowerment to do that, and then secondly creating a world where, or creating a space where they can meet a selection of different people who are all explicitly saying, this is my path, this is what it's given to me, this is what I'm embodying, this is what I'm sharing from it. And like feel into your resonance of like, oh, which people really resonate with you, which words, which practices, which, so that people kind of have that agency to try things, move around things, while also staying in connection with what they feel about themselves.
Yeah, there's a few things there. Yes. Yeah, one of the things that comes up immediately is like a larger problem with a lot of, it's just a sociological reality of the thing. But for a lot of inner work, like people come to it very often when they are lost and confused and don't know what they want and things have fallen apart. So that's an especially dangerous time to have people trying to pull you into things without that wider context, right?
Yeah.
One of my best examples of one of my angriest examples of the wider context thing was just I went to a Vipassana retreat and they were just telling me like, ignore images, ignore anything that comes up in meditation, lights, visuals, images, internal stuff. Stay away from all of it. It's unhelpful. It's distraction. It's bad for the path, et cetera, et cetera. And then on that retreat, I was getting like very intense imagery that from where I am now, I'm realizing was pure gold, like should have been diving into that very deeply. And that stayed around for a long time, this attitude of like, oh, they told me to ignore this stuff, so I've got to stay away from it. They told me not to lean into it, so I'll not do it. When very clearly, like, the images and imaginal were my path. And it took me much longer to get around to figuring that out and finding any kind of context for what was happening there, specifically because they provided no context. They didn't provide a like, this is unhelpful for the type of thing that we are doing. Like functionally, we are doing this, this, and this. That's the straight line there. This stuff might come up. It's outside of our scope. It's not part of what we're doing. And it's actively like distracting and destructive to the thing that we are trying to do, rather than just a full stop, no context, like these are bad, stay away from them. They're distractions, get away. That's the thing I try to avoid as much as possible when talking around this stuff, and just to loosen around other people as well. Is these things aren't, X, whatever it is not great for the specific path you are following, for the specific thing you're trying to point at. But it is an intrinsic part of other paths, for example. And yeah, that seems incredibly important, especially given that so many of the people who come to the beginnings of these things are lost, confused, not sure what's going on, and know very little about the general landscape. A lot of the defenses that I hear for a lot of these 101 things that are extremely locked and walled gardens often kind of presuppose like, oh, well, everyone should know like this full wide landscape of practice and context, so we don't really need to mention it. Like, no one knows that for like 5 years after of like deep study of, oh wait, I've literally had people ask me before, like, wait, what's open awareness meditation? Like, that's not a thing. Like, oh, meditation's about focus. I'm like, no, that's one very specific type of meditation. There's these other, okay, here's a Google link. This is what open awareness meditation. And yeah, like people just don't know a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, totally. And I think often the teachers also don't know. Is part of it.
That is an unfortunate thing that I have noticed over time as well. You didn't know either. Okay, this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. The metaphor of a walled garden is funny because the retreat I got kicked off
right.
climbing the wall of a walled garden. That's metaphors we live by.
Another aspect of myth and metaphor. They tend to invade our lives very abruptly and are not subtle about it.
Totally. I think it really being my story to not find the place that could essentially allow me to be the expression that I needed to be in the world, looking for that in lots of different places and not finding it, and now being very passionate about wanting to help people find their own expression, be able to be really deeply in touch with what is true for them, and have a place in the world that's like encouraging there's connection available, all of those things, not having to choose between inner world and outer world or something. It was key.